This is the Drake Passage, a name that strikes fear into the hearts of sailors, often called the deadliest stretch of water on Earth. At its most furious, waves here can surge to an astonishing 18 meters, but that's merely the beginning of its wrath. Storms can rage for days, with monstrous waves attacking from every direction. Countless videos document the harrowing conditions and the thousands of lives claimed by these treacherous waters. One might assume that such a notorious place would have an abundance of detailed accounts of lost ships. Yet, the truth is far more mysterious than you might imagine. Welcome to Echoes of Time, where we unravel the chilling secrets of the Drake Passage. In this video, we will explore why this waterway is so infamous, delve into the few notable incidents that shed light on its dangers, and uncover the profound role Antarctica plays in these tales of peril. Join us as we explore the enigma of why, despite countless lives lost, detailed records of its shipwrecks remain so elusive. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the night of November 29, 2022, the cruise ship Viking Polaris was in the midst of the treacherous crossing every Antarctic voyage must undertake, the Drake Passage. The vessel was northbound for Ushuaia, Argentina, having turned back from Antarctica under less than ideal circumstances. Just a day prior, during an excursion involving inflatable Zodiac boats, one passenger was injured and another had fallen into the frigid water. The incident was severe enough to disrupt the crew's operations, necessitating a medical evacuation. By the time the ship entered the open waters near Cape Horn in Chile, everyone on board knew the journey south had not unfolded as planned. Yet they had no inkling that events were about to take a far more dire turn. As the Polaris pressed onward, without warning, a colossal wave slammed into its side. Within several cabins, windows imploded, sending shards of glass flying across the rooms. The ship lurched violently, transforming loose objects into dangerous projectiles before eventually settling back to an even keel. Tragically, inside one of the damaged rooms, a 62-year-old American woman was struck by debris with such immense force that she succumbed to her injuries. 4 other passengers also sustained injuries, but fortunately survived. Crew members swiftly moved to secure the damaged areas and attend to the wounded, all while the ship continued its course toward Argentina. The following day, the Polaris reached Ushuaia. From the exterior, the ship appeared somewhat battered in certain areas, but the internal damage was considerably more extensive. The wave that struck the Polaris has since been identified as an infamous rogue wave, an oceanic phenomenon still largely misunderstood. Unlike regular waves or ordinary swells, rogue waves behave erratically. They appear to rise suddenly, often towering many meters above the surrounding sea, defying typical patterns. Peculiarly, they do not follow the prevailing wind or swell direction. Those who have encountered them often describe them as steep, fast, and violent walls of water. For centuries, tales of rogue waves were dismissed as mere sailors' exaggerations. It is only in recent decades that scientific instruments have confirmed their existence and their capacity to strike with enough force to severely damage large ships. Even today, they remain incredibly difficult to predict and almost impossible to avoid if a vessel finds itself in their path. What made the Viking Polaris incident particularly unsettling was its context. This occurred aboard a modern polar vessel, specifically designed for harsh environments and operating with advanced forecasting and highly experienced crews. Yet, a single wave was powerful enough to shatter reinforced windows and tragically kill a passenger within her cabin. Though she may not have realized it, this made her another entry on the long and somber list of victims claimed by the Drake Passage. The Drake Passage is the expanse of ocean separating South America from Antarctica, a mandatory route for every vessel traveling by sea to the southern continent. There are no alternative paths around it. Once you leave the shelter of either landmass, there is no turning back. Its formidable reputation predates modern shipping by centuries, with sailors long regarding it as one of the most challenging and stressful crossings in the world. The passage has earned this notoriety because it lies completely exposed to relentless winds, powerful currents, and massive swells for hundreds of kilometers. Storms and ice can materialize rapidly, as can the extremely dangerous rogue waves we've discussed. It is also one of the most energetic bodies of water on the planet, a characteristic rooted millions of years in the past. Long before any ship ventured so far south, Antarctica and South America were once connected. As these two landmasses slowly drifted apart due to plate tectonics, a deep water channel opened between them. This geological shift gave rise to a powerful, globe-circling ocean current, now known as the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which flows directly through the Drake Passage. What sets this current apart from any other on Earth is its unobstructed path. There is literally no landmass to impede its flow as it moves west to east around Antarctica, continuously gathering strength. When it funnels through the relatively narrower Drake Passage, it accelerates dramatically. The sheer volume of water involved is staggering. The amount that surges through this area every second easily dwarfs that of the Amazon River. The passage itself is immense, stretching roughly 966 kilometers across and plunging to average depths of around 3,350 meters. This profound depth is crucial, as it allows colossal waves to form and travel vast distances without losing energy. Add to this the prevailing westerly winds, which blow hard and consistently, and you have a system in a constant state of violent churning. The weather further exacerbates conditions as warm air masses from the Pacific collide with colder southern air, fostering the rapid formation of cyclones that wreak havoc in the region. Storms can intensify quickly and move at high speeds, sometimes catching ships in conditions that deteriorate far faster than any forecast might suggest. Sea ice introduces yet another layer of unpredictability. During the Southern Hemisphere's summer, the passage is typically ice-free, which is when most ships attempt the crossing. However, as winter approaches, ice spreads northward from Antarctica, rendering the region almost impassable. Even during the most favorable times of the year, the Drake Passage is never truly an easy crossing. Given these formidable challenges, it might seem logical to avoid the Drake Passage entirely. Historically, sailors did have other options around South America, such as the Strait of Magellan or the Beagle Channel. However, while these routes offered some respite from the open seas, they presented their own distinct problems. These passages are narrow, winds shift frequently and unpredictably, tidal currents are exceptionally strong, and there is very little margin for error. In contrast, the Drake Passage, despite its dangers, offered captains the luxury of hundreds of kilometers of open ocean where a ship could maneuver. This critical trade-off profoundly influenced centuries of maritime decision-making. Furthermore, for any vessel heading directly south toward Antarctica, the Drake Passage simply remained the most practical route, a truth that holds even today. Interestingly, for centuries, European cartographers debated the very existence of open water south of the Americas. Many believed the southern seas were entirely blocked by land, or that any potential route would be utterly impossible to navigate. This perception dramatically shifted thanks to the man the passage is named after, Sir Francis Drake. Yet, Drake never intentionally set out to discover a new ocean corridor. In 1578, while navigating the Strait of Magellan during his circumnavigation of the globe, one of his ships was violently blown far south by ferocious storms. What Drake and his crew realized from this harrowing mishap was the undeniable presence of open water just below the tip of South America. This discovery further hinted at a direct connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Drake himself never sailed the route that now bears his name, but his accidental discovery paved the way for the passage's first documented crossing decades later. In 1616, a Flemish expedition successfully navigated the waters south of Cape Horn, definitively proving that an open passage existed. Subsequently, as global sea traffic surged through the late 1700s and early 1800s, an increasing number of ships began venturing into these southern waters. Before the Panama Canal opened in 1914, the Drake Passage played a pivotal role in global shipping, serving as one of the few viable options for vessels moving between the Atlantic and Pacific. Whaling fleets also began operating farther south in the 19th century, adding even more traffic to this demanding stretch of ocean. And with that increased traffic, inevitably came significant losses. Over time, with increasing maritime activity in the region, the Drake Passage accumulated shipwrecks at an alarming rate. One of its most famous and tragic stories involves a ship named the Santelmo. Launched in the late 1780s, she was a formidable, full-size Spanish warship armed with 74 guns. By 1819, Spain was desperately fighting to retain its colonies in South America, and the Santelmo became part of this struggle. In July of that year, the ship departed Buenos Aires with orders to reinforce Spanish forces in Peru, where independence movements were rapidly gaining momentum. The Santelmo entered the deep waters of the Drake Passage by early September. This was undoubtedly the most perilous segment of her journey, and somewhere within those unforgiving waters, the Santelmo encountered severe weather. The exact events remain unknown, as there were no survivors or eyewitnesses to the tragedy. The ship was last sighted on September 2nd near the eastern edge of the South Shetland Islands, just off the coast of Antarctica. After that, she simply vanished. At the time, the prevailing assumption was that the Santelmo had been overwhelmed by a powerful storm, perhaps a cyclone, and sank with all 644 people on board. In such frigid waters, survival would have been a matter of mere minutes. For a while, this remained the accepted narrative. However, evidence soon began washing ashore. Approximately a year after the ship disappeared, sealers working near Livingston Island in the South Shetland Islands reported finding pieces of wreckage. Beams and other debris, clearly originating from a large wooden ship, started to appear on the beaches. This was a significant discovery because Livingston Island lies close to Antarctica, far south of where most sailing ships were expected to drift after a wreck. This raised the intriguing possibility that at least part of the Santelmo had reached the Antarctic region. For over a century, the ship's ultimate fate remained uncertain. Then, in 1960, an Argentinian expedition discovered more remains of a shipwreck along the coast of Livingston Island. The structure and materials perfectly matched what would be expected from an early 19th century warship. While debate persists to this day, many historians and maritime experts now believe these remains belong to the Santelmo. If this theory is correct, it implies that some of those aboard may have survived long enough to reach land. This would tragically make them the first humans to set foot on Antarctica, only to perish there, cold and utterly isolated. However, with no journals or evidence of a campsite found on the continent, what truly transpired remains a matter of speculation. Antarctica itself forms another crucial chapter in the history of the Drake Passage. By the time the wreckage of the Santelmo began to wash ashore, the southern continent was already emerging as a mysterious and perilous destination. It promised unprecedented scientific discovery and the ultimate test of human endurance. Reaching it, however, invariably meant confronting the Drake Passage. At the turn of the 20th century, this was still literally uncharted territory. Vast stretches of the Antarctic Peninsula remained unmapped, and even fundamental questions about the continent were unanswered. Expeditions heading south were thus sailing into an environment where rescue was virtually impossible and communication with the outside world was non-existent. One vessel destined to test these limits was a Norwegian-built ship aptly named the Antarctic. Launched in 1871, she began her life as a whaling ship before transitioning into an expedition vessel, joining the Swedish Antarctic expedition in 1901. The expedition was led by Otto Nordenskjöld, a Swedish geologist. Even seasoned explorers like Nordenskjöld at the time did not fully comprehend the challenges that lay ahead. His plan was meticulous. He would land a small party to overwinter and conduct surveys, while the ship, under the command of Captain Carl Anton Larsen, would support them by sea. It was an ambitious but not necessarily reckless plan. The crew was highly capable, and the ship had proven herself in southern waters. Captain Larsen was also no stranger to navigating through thick ice fields. Yet, despite all the preparation, the success of the entire venture hinged on timing and conditions that no one could truly control. Once the ship made it through the Drake Passage and turned south, there would be no easy retreat if things went awry. As planned, Nordenskjöld and a small party of crewmen were put ashore on Snow Hill Island in early 1902. There, they constructed a simple hut and prepared to overwinter, diligently carrying out scientific work. The ship was to leave them, continue its own work elsewhere, and return the following season to collect them. Once the Antarctic sailed away, the 6 men on Snow Hill Island were completely isolated. The ensuing winter was exceptionally harsh, even by Antarctic standards. Storms reportedly tore through the area, damaging part of their hut and sweeping away one of their small boats. Several of their sled dogs were also lost in a blizzard. Despite these setbacks, the men remained productive. They were well supplied, and once the worst of winter passed, Nordenskjöld and his companions embarked on a long sled journey, covering hundreds of kilometers as they surveyed the coastline. Afterward, they returned to Snow Hill, exhausted but successful, just in time for the ship's expected reappearance. But it never came. Unbeknownst to the land party, the Antarctic had been fighting its own desperate battle in the Drake Passage. During the summer of 1902 to 1903, the ship attempted to reach Snow Hill, but found its path completely blocked by heavy pack ice off the northeastern coast of the peninsula. With no immediate way through, a risky decision was made. Captain Larsen left 3 men at Hope Bay, near the entrance to the Antarctic Sound, with instructions to attempt an overland journey to reach Nordenskjöld's party. However, shortly after their departure, the ice they intended to cross broke up and drifted out to sea, leaving open water in its place. Without a boat and unable to continue, they turned back toward Hope Bay, only to discover that the ship was no longer where they expected it to be. While the party of 3 struggled on land, Captain Larsen continued searching for an alternative sea route. In doing so, the ship became hopelessly trapped in the ice. Initially, there was hope it might break free, but that hope quickly faded. Within weeks, the immense pressure of the ice on the ship became unbearable. 6 weeks after becoming frozen in, the crew was forced to abandon the ship entirely. Not long after that, the Antarctic was crushed and sank, roughly 45 kilometers from land. Over the next 2 weeks, the crew hauled supplies across unstable ice floes that constantly shifted beneath their feet. The powerful currents threatened to pull the floes out into open water at any moment. But eventually, after a final desperate day of rowing their lifeboats through freezing seas, they reached Paulette Island at the end of 1903. This timing proved incredibly fortuitous, as a violent storm swept across the island the very next day. Had the men still been stranded on the ice, it is highly probable that none would have survived. At this point, the expedition had fractured into 3 isolated groups. Nordenskjöld and 5 others remained on Snow Hill Island, living in their hut as their supplies dwindled. The party of 3 at Hope Bay constructed crude shelters from rocks, scraps of wood, and tarps, even insulating the ground with penguin skins. Finally, on Paulette Island, Captain Larsen and 13 crew members built a rough stone shelter of their own, roofing it with sailcloth and sealskins. For all 3 groups, penguins and seals provided essential meat, and their fat was burned for heat and light. As the months dragged on, there was no way of knowing if anyone was coming to help them. Before leaving South America, Captain Larsen had left instructions with the Argentinian Navy. If the ship failed to return by a certain date, a search was to be organized. The following season, ice conditions were significantly lighter than the year before, allowing a ship named the Uruguay to push south. On October 12, 1903, Nordenskjöld was out sledding when he spotted something in the distance. At first, he mistook what he was seeing for penguins, but as he drew closer, he realized they were the party of 3 from Hope Bay. Upon their meeting, it took Nordenskjöld a moment to recognize them. The men were apparently so filthy from months of burning penguin blubber that he barely knew who they were. That very same day, the Uruguay also reached Snow Hill Island. As its officers were inquiring if Nordenskjöld had seen the rest of the crew from the Antarctic, Captain Larsen himself suddenly appeared at the hut with the others from his group, having just arrived from Paulet Island. After nearly 2 years of isolation, every surviving member of the expedition was suddenly and unexpectedly reunited. In total, only a single man died during the entire ordeal, succumbing to heart failure within the Paulet Island group. Every other member made it out alive. In November 1903, they returned to Buenos Aires to an enthusiastic welcome. The wreck of the Antarctic marked the first documented case of a ship being destroyed by ice pressure in Antarctic waters. When it comes to historical shipwrecks in the Drake Passage, none looms larger than that of the Endurance, perhaps the most famous expedition in history. Approximately a decade after Nordenskjöld and his crew were saved, the Irish explorer Ernest Shackleton launched the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914 with the ambitious goal of being the first to complete a land crossing of Antarctica. Aboard the ship named the Endurance, Shackleton departed London with a crew of 28. After weeks at sea, the ship reached South Georgia Island on November 5th. At the time, the island was a bustling hub of the Antarctic whaling industry, and Shackleton used the stop to gather crucial information and supplies. He also received repeated, grave warnings. Whalers informed him that the sea ice in the Weddell Sea was unusually heavy that year, and that conditions further south were likely to be exceptionally brutal. Shackleton listened, but ultimately chose to disregard these warnings, pressing ahead regardless. Just days after leaving South Georgia, the Endurance encountered its first significant ice pack in the Drake Passage, and progress slowed to a crawl. By early January 1915, the ship was battling its way through ever-tightening fields of ice. After 7 weeks of this arduous struggle, the Endurance could advance no further. The ship became completely trapped and frozen in the ice, roughly a day's journey from the expedition's intended landing point on the Antarctic coast. Locked in place, the ship began to drift with the pack, moving south at first and then slowly back north as the vast ice sheet shifted. This agonizing drift continued for months. As winter approached, daylight faded and temperatures plummeted. Shackleton did his utmost to maintain crew morale by keeping his men busy, but the immense pressure on the ship's hull relentlessly increased. Many months later, by late October, the hull was no longer safe. Ice pressed in from all sides, warping beams and splitting the timbers. Finally, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, and all 28 crewmen made their way onto the relative safety of the ice. A camp was established on a nearby floe, and the men salvaged what they could as they watched the Endurance slowly succumb to the crushing ice. On November 21st, the hull finally gave way and slipped beneath the ice, vanishing into the Weddell Sea. With no ship and no immediate land in sight, the men remained camped on drifting ice floes. They hauled their lifeboats and supplies as the pack slowly carried them further north. Again, this ordeal stretched on for months, and when food supplies began to dwindle, even the sled dogs were not spared. It wasn't until April 1916 that the ice finally began to break apart once more. Out of options, Shackleton ordered the men into the lifeboats. After 5 strenuous days at sea, they eventually reached Elephant Island, setting foot on solid ground for the first time in nearly 500 days. Their relief, however, was short-lived. Elephant Island is one of the most remote places on Earth, offering no hope of immediate rescue. Recognizing this grim reality, Shackleton selected 5 men and, taking one of the lifeboats, embarked on an extraordinary journey of roughly 1,480 kilometers to South Georgia Island. While this audacious decision might have been their only hope of survival, every moment of the trip was an absolute nightmare. The small boat was constantly threatened by ferocious storms. Everyone suffered from severe seasickness, and at one point, a rogue wave nearly capsized the vessel, threatening to end the voyage entirely. 17 days after leaving Elephant Island, they made landfall on South Georgia. However, they landed on an uninhabited side of the island, and their boat was too damaged to continue. Shackleton then chose 2 of the men to join him in an arduous overland trek across South Georgia on foot. Along the way, they scaled mountains and navigated terrain no human had ever mapped or traversed before. Finally, after 30 hours of continuous travel, they reached the whaling station in Stromness, and rescue efforts immediately commenced to save the rest of the crew. It would take 4 total attempts over the course of several months to reach Elephant Island. Ice conditions blocked the first 3 tries, and by the time Shackleton finally broke through on August 30th, 1916, the men he had left behind were on the very brink of starvation. Against all conceivable odds, every single one of them was brought back to safety, alive. More than a century later, in 2022, the wreck of the Endurance was finally located, nearly 3,000 meters below the surface of the Weddell Sea. By now, you might be wondering why we've spent so much time discussing events that, while technically commencing in the Drake Passage, don't always focus on the immediate vicinity of the waterway itself. The truth is, when it comes to detailed accounts of its direct casualties, this is largely all there is. The Drake Passage is estimated to have claimed hundreds of ships and over 10,000 sailors throughout history. Yet, the grim reality is that almost all of these vessels sank without a single survivor. Furthermore, many of these losses occurred centuries ago in a region that, even today, is sparsely populated. Hundreds of years ago, it was merely men in wooden ships battling massive swells with no hope of rescue or even anyone left to remember their names. The stories we do possess are those rare instances where someone miraculously survived to recount what happened. Ultimately, even with advanced weather reporting and modern purpose-built vessels, the Drake Passage remains one of the most challenging and formidable seas on Earth. Crossings are routinely delayed or canceled entirely, a testament to its enduring power. This stark reality underscores the profound respect and caution it demands from all who dare to navigate its waters.